against the spread of fake news. I'm delighted that we have the members of the Libya and the INGIT committees, and a special welcome to the chair of the INGIT committee, Mr. Raphael Glucksmann. And we've been, since the setup of the INGIT committee, of which I'm a member, we've had great cooperation. And let me, Mr. Glucksmann, I'd like to give you the floor.
Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, dear Sabine. Yes, our cooperation has been working beautifully, and I'd like to express thanks to you for having taken this initiative and working with the INGIT committee to get this meeting going. And I think it's something fundamental. This is really a key moment of time. This is a decisive moment when it comes to the war of information, when it comes to fighting propaganda and disinformation on the part of Russian networks. As of the 24th of February, there's been the aggression on Ukraine by Russia, but this isn't the beginning of their disinformation campaigns in Europe. It's been going on for quite some time now, and over the past 18 months, we've been looking into this. Who are the players? What are the impacts? And we've drawn up a report, and it's rather straightforward and clear and addresses the issue of independent journalism. And there's an effort that has to be made in Europe at present to see to it that our democracies go on benefiting from independent journalism, investigative journalism, quality journalism. And to do that, we have to protect journalists legally, economically, and it's also facing the fact that journalism, independent journalism and media pluralism have to be seen as more than just a matter of a market. There's more to it than that. And then what is the definition of what a media is? And when it comes to what we've seen now over the past few years is the use of propaganda tools, and they are given the name media, but they're not media. It's Putin. I mean, we've heard about Sputnik and RT. That hit the headlines, and there's a need now to define what protections are required for media, for journalists, and what is a medium, so that it won't just be a propaganda tool at the service of a regime that triggers a war with Ukraine, but that also undermines our principles and our interests. And there's a consultation that we have seen carried out from June to March, and we've come up with the European Media Freedom Act. That's in the works, and it would be good to hear what you have to say about these consultations and the idea of this EMFA, and then the hopes when it comes to what the public authorities can do to preserve the possibility to having high-quality independent journalism in our countries. The information war is not restricted to the borders of the EU or to Russia at present. For instance, when it comes to the cereals and famine, there too Russia is afoot with disinformation, and we in Europe have the advantage in our societies to cover the war in Ukraine, and the Russian propaganda has not managed to undermine our effectiveness. And elsewhere in the world, for instance, in Africa, they do have access to our media. So we have to think together what we can do as public authorities in Europe to help journalism and to face up to this major offensive on the part of a regime that not only shuts down independent media in Russia, but plans to undermine all connection with the truth elsewhere in the world. So I'm dead keen on hearing what our guests have to say about these fundamental issues, and thank you for having invited me along.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. The Kremlin's war against Ukraine is also war against information, and it's undermining, of course, journalism everywhere it treads. When it comes to this broad invasion, the Russian armed forces targeted journalists intentionally and sought to destroy broadcasting infrastructure. And over and beyond that, the Russian citizens are deprived of any information about the operations taking place in Ukraine. And the legal framework has been tightened up. There's no free speech anymore. Access to Facebook and major platforms have been blocked. And whoever allegedly spreads false information can end up behind bars for 15 years. And even holding up an empty poster was already grounds for arrest, because one could have written something on it, then that would not have been approved. You could see how paranoid they are now in Russia, and also the strategy to see to it that citizens are only fed information that comes from the state. The shortage of free media, and given the massive suppression of the political opposition, has dreadful consequences. And as a result of that, a lot of journalists who were working independently and freely, but they and activists and civil organization members are fleeing Russia and is looking for asylum in the EU or neighboring countries to try there to go on and report and see that information flow into Russia. Independent information about the war in Ukraine in particular. Now, against that backdrop, our discussion today, will be very interesting. It will give us an overview of what's up in Russia and Ukraine, but over and beyond that, the general picture as to what's up in terms of undermining the media. And democracy is based on the need for free media and journalism. I would now like to welcome our guest speakers most warmly. First of all, Mr. Oliver Money-Curley. He is the director of the Europe International Press Institute, IPI. We have Ms. Renate Schröder. She's the director of the European Association of Journalists. She's online. We have Mr. Jean-Paul Martos, journalist, professor for international journalism at the UCL, and he's the editorial coordinator of the Council of Europe report, Defending Press Freedom of Times of Tension and Conflict 2022. We have Ms. Julie Mayrzak, the head of the Brussels office of Reporters Without Borders, and I'd like to very warmly welcome three brave journalists from Russia. Ms. Katerina Abramova, she's the director for communication at Medusa, an independent online platform. Denis Konvievsky, he's in charge of cooperative operations at Medusa, as well as Denis Katev, a journalist from TV Rain, which until it was shut down in March 2022, i.e. of this year, and now he is active in Paris at Radio France. And then there's the Commission representatives with the word welcome. Give a special welcome to, first of all, Mr. Giuseppe Abamonte, Director for Media and Policy from DG Connect. I don't know if he's online. He'll be turning up later on. Then from the EEAS, Mr. Jan Letal, Information and Communications Officer and expert for strategic communication. And we begin now our exchange of views. Well, let me begin by giving the floor to Ms. Renate Schröder. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Okay, good morning. I thought it was Oliver Money-Curl. Never mind. Vielen Dank, Sabine Verheyen.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Opportunity given to discuss with Bold, Kalt, Liebe and Inge the issues indeed at the heart of the European Federation of Journalists in these difficult times on media freedom and protection of journalists. I'm still in Izmir, so sorry for not being there with you, where we just finished our general meeting with 49 organizations from 32 countries present, including from the Ukraine and Russia, adopting many resolutions, including on safety, media freedom, the urgent need for support for local journalism, including local journalism in the Ukraine. In 2022 alone, 13 journalists in Europe lost their life while on duty, 12 of them while reporting the war. 12 journalists in now 4 months for the people's right to know. Journalism has become a dangerous and very precarious mission throughout Europe, and not only for war reporters. Jean-Paul Matos will talk about the increased alerts regarding attacks against journalists, be it physical or online. When we discuss media freedom and protection of journalist issues, we have to look at it from a holistic approach. And that's why I will refer to our ambitions for the European Media Freedom Act at the end. Our colleagues in Turkey told us that 90% of the media market is captured. That means controlled by politicians and business. Unfortunately, this is not unique to Turkey. The problem of media captures is a serious one we have within the European Union and not only in Hungary and Poland. My fellow speaker, Oliver Manikel, will outline these threats in detail. This all is aggravated by recent moves by many governments to completely silence the media by adopting dangerous so-called laws on disinformation. The recent example from Russia and Turkey show this, but we have others from Hungary and Greece, for example. Such a bill where the definition of disinformation is left so vague puts journalists at risk of criminal action for posting information that the government disagrees with. Disinformation is an important issue and needs to be combated, but not at the price of restricting journalists' rights and the public's right of freedom of expression. You will discuss this in the second panel, but I want to stress that the EFJ is against censoring or banning. We call on the EU policymakers to strengthen self-regulation and co-regulation, to continue projects like the one the EFJ is leading on media councils in the digital world, and to strengthen and protect independent journalism. How can you build a sustainable business model when journalists face fear of being attacked, judicially prosecuted, and self-censor themselves? How can you build trust and fight disinformation when you work under precarious conditions, when your employer does not invest in training or digital safety or investigative tools or artificial intelligence? And cut and paste journalism, clickbait, becomes the norm in an ever more fragile news industry, which is, as we all know, competing with the logics of social media and its attention-based economy. We talk about market failure in journalism and the challenge of sustainable funding of media viability, in particular at local level. The Center for Press and Media Freedom in Florence, with a special COVID-19 edition last year, showed that on media viability, 10 countries within the EU scored a high risk. And let me quote, "Employment and salary trends highlight a high risk for the economic safety of journalists despite the surge in demand for information and trusted sources. In particular, the growing number of ever more precarious freelance journalists underline this high risk." So what do we need to do also with regard, as I just said, and as Mr. Glucksmann said, regarding the upcoming European Media Freedom Act? Let me just summarize, giving you 4 points which are important in my mind. First, we need to re-establish the notion of journalism as a public good. And for that, we need support from many stakeholders, including the European Parliament, and I'm grateful for your welcoming support this morning. It needs protecting in its own right. It needs support through public, private, and philanthropic funding, of course, always at arm's length. It also needs social protection, in particular for freelancers. We need to fight media capture through full transparency of ownership and allocation of state aid. And yes, we do need to discuss what kind of media we wish to protect. Self-regulation, as I said, and guarantees of right of freedom of expression and media freedom are crucial today. On safety, we need to convince governments of the priority of protecting journalists and enabling them to do their work by creating a safe environment. The EU safety recommendation adopted last year gives an excellent framework, but it needs to be implemented at national level. And for that, as we all know, political will is so important. This includes the importance of sufficient funding to ensure that journalists and fixers working in war zones have the necessary equipment and utmost protection. Media organizations have a duty of care, sending their staff and freelancers to war zones. We are working with a coalition of press freedom, digital rights and journalist groups to make sure the EU will deliver and adopt a strong, hopefully regulation, a strong European Media Freedom Act reflecting such a holistic approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frau Renate Schröder. Und unser nächster Sprecher ist...
The next speaker is Oliver Monet-Curley.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and just apologies for not being with you today in the Parliament. Unfortunately, I have a meeting at 10 o'clock with that coalition of media freedom and freedom of expression groups that Renata just referred to at immediately afterwards at 10 o'clock, where we are trying to define and agree our positions on the Media Freedom Act. Look, may I just start by saying that IPI, International Press Institute, we have a media violations tracker monitoring the situation, the front line, the information war on the front line of Ukraine, and the casualties today. Statistics read some 437 different types of media freedom alerts or violations in Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, etc. since 24th of February. This includes the 12 killed journalists, 82 verbal online and physical attacks, 90 arrests or charges against journalists, some 167 incidents of censorship, 3 new laws in Russia, and 6 restrictions on access to information. That is not a totally comprehensive overview, but it gives you an extent of the intensity of the information warfare that is taking place as part of the actual physical conflict. I'd also like to sort of quote Dmitry Muravyev, who's the editor of Novaya Gazeta, on World Press Freedom Day, when he addressed the event in the Beaux-Arts here in Brussels on the 3rd of May, when he asked the question about how is it that the future of the entire world lies in the hands of one man. And he put this down to the death of independent journalism in Russia, and that is what set the stage for enabling him to be in this position. The horrors of war, I think, have exposed just how vulnerable our democracies are. And yet here in Europe, we're seeing how the same mechanisms and processes used in Russia and Turkey, as Renata has referred to gain control over media spaces are being adapted, perfected and employed here in member states in the European Union. And it's happening under our noses. And in many ways we have been complicit in this and providing consent, because by turning a blind eye, the EU has been giving consent to this process here. Democracy dies when good people do nothing. In April, Fidesz won another landslide victory in Hungary, an election campaign where the public broadcaster, I use the term public broadcaster quite broadly there, I should say the state propaganda arm, afforded the opposition leading candidate 5 minutes only to give his position in the entire election campaign. This is neither a free nor fair election. And when that takes place, the very fundamentals of the values of our European democracy are at risk. The last decade has seen independent media sector gutted by Fidesz that has misused the powers and the finances of the state to ensure the vast majority of media in the hands of its inner circle. They filled the media regulator with Fidesz loyalists to silence independent voices from the airwaves and reduce the independent media sector to effectively a niche interest. As Renata mentioned earlier, we call this process media capture, and its success is being closely replicated. We've seen that in Poland, we've seen that in Bulgaria, Czech Republic, and obviously Slovenia. All of these have suffered variations along the same theme. And in Slovenia's case, it wasn't just replicated, it was exported. It was exported through the use of Hungarian capital, purchasing and investing in media aligned with Fidesz's ideological ally, the SDS. Now, Slovenia's election and the Czech election a few months earlier were, of course, a rebuke to the illiberal political model. And reforming governments have an opportunity and a duty to make good on their promises of reform. But the threat has not gone away, and they cannot do it alone. If there is something positive to have emerged from this war, then it is that it is concentrating minds and refocusing efforts to protect our democratic spaces from the disaster that has befallen Russia's. When I ask editors in Eastern Europe what the most important thing the EU can do to stop media capture, their first reply is to stop funding it. The EU must do that. But it can also do much more. And we're very pleased that finally the Commission, over the last couple of years, has taken this issue, started to take this issue with the seriousness that it deserves, and have drafted, or in the process of drafting, the European Media Freedom Act. And this provides a unique opportunity to develop the tools, rules and standards to confront the drivers of media capture. Renata has already highlighted some of the principles that we share in terms of wanting to see in the Media Freedom Act. Transparency is probably the most important one. Transparency of media ownership and of financial relations between the state and media actors, throwing the light onto the true owners and the true beneficiaries of media and of relations with the government is the most essential step to addressing the problem. Secondly, setting tight rules for state funding of media to ensure it cannot be politicised and abused to create a compliant media sector. The next step being a cheerleading propaganda sector is vital. Renata's refers to the abuse of state advertising rules, of public subsidies, etc., and the need for having arm's length independent funding mechanisms with clear criteria that awards quality public interest journalism over clientelism. Importantly, and I know that there are some concerns about the impact on the media economy of regulation out there, but we believe that such an act would help reduce or remove the barriers to the media market that currently exist in media captured states. Clientelist media have an unfair advantage because of their subsidies and their relationships with the state, which prevent investments into media. By lowering those barriers, we believe that this will give a massive boost to Europe's media economy as a whole. Thirdly, we think that there should be media pluralism tests for media mergers and other instruments to monitor and measure the impact of media pluralism across Europe. Fourthly, we support any initiative that can help improve and strengthen the independence of media regulators and increase the standards thereof. That's an extremely complex issue, but anything that EMFA can do to that will be welcome. And finally, funding innovation and creativity in the market to ensure a vibrant media economy is essential. Without a vibrant, profitable media economy, there will be no media pluralism. Lastly, Renat also referred to this, but the banning of RT and Sputnik obviously caused a big debate, and many of us argued and disagreed on whether the ban should have taken place and how it took place, etc. Most importantly, though, it's opened up a debate, and a really important debate, about how we protect our democracies from investments from countries that are fundamentally opposed and hostile to our democratic values. And I welcome that debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now the last speaker in our first panel is Jean-Paul Marteau. I will give the floor to Mr. Marteau. Please press the speak button.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. Merci, Monsieur Glucksmann.
Yes,
Je suis le seul ici, en fait.
I'm the only person who's actually here in the room. It's a pleasure to be here. I haven't been here for 2 years. I coordinate the work of the Defending Press Freedom in Times of Tension and Conflict work at the COE. We bring together the IPI, Journalists Without Borders, and so on. So we draw on the alerts that have been raised, and we take stock of what's happening in the Council of Europe countries. Of course, Russia has been suspended after its invasion of Ukraine. So we look at what's happened to journalists, if it could include attacks, and many other categories of attacks against journalists. So this year, the situation in Ukraine and the Russian invasion has really upended everything. The consequences on press freedom are massive. The first is that if you're a war correspondent in Ukraine, you're at massive risk. They're the ones who are telling us about the war. This reminds us of other wars that we have forgotten. Wars, a war from the 90s, the war in the Balkans, where around 150 journalists were killed. Already, a few dozen journalists have died, as we've heard from Reporters Without Borders, and there have been complaints submitted to the International Criminal Court by journalists stating that there are war crimes being committed. So that's the situation. Then there is also repression and censorship of independent journalists in Russia. That is the end of a long process, and the platform has enumerated and chronicled the worsening of the situation in Russia over recent years. We've seen that journalists have been labelled as foreign agents, and then we've also got Memorial, which is an important source of information for journalists. Now, the questions we're asking ourselves are key ones, are evident. How do we protect journalists if they're covering the war in Ukraine? How do we inform people about what's happening in Russia? Because there's a real blockage. Russia would like to impose its so-called splinter net. It wants to have its own internet sovereignty and protect its citizens from any harmful outside information from outside its borders. So there's really a lot at stake. These are complicated matters. So how do we bypass Russian censorship when we have to be aware of the fact that the Russian state is able to crack down on VPNs and deals with foreign media outlets abroad? The BBC has relaunched its Russian language radio, but that's been jammed. So how do we help Russian journalists who are under constant pressure from the state? How do we help those Russian journalists who have fled? They often find it difficult to get a visa and to set up shop in new countries, in the countries where they're being welcomed. So all of that is very important. Then there's a rather divisive element. I mean, I am the coordinator, but there is a split in the journalistic profession. There's the issue of whether RT should be banned or not. What is very clear in our report is that Russia has relays in, or has antenna in various member states. So there's not just a geopolitical dimension here, there's an ideological dimension. If you allow me to compare, basically, it's been 50 years since Watergate. Why am I talking about Watergate today in the European Parliament when we should be talking about Ukraine? Well, the two journalists that were behind Watergate, they've published an introduction to their new book, Shadows of the President. They compare Trump and Nixon in that book. They say Nixon abused power, but he never called American democracy into question. But Trump, seditiously, has called into question the very basis of democracy. That's what's happening in Russia today as well, but also in various other European countries. There are states and governments and political parties who are calling liberal democracy into question and the bedrock on which the EU is based. That's a true danger. I think that some of my colleagues will mention the measures that have been adopted by governments, so taking control of the media and regulators. It's what they've been doing. So I'll just take 30 seconds to talk about the rest of the report. There is a lot more violence against journalists, including more physical violence. Last year, there were 82 physical attacks against journalists. That's a 51% increase on the previous year, 2020. There's an exponential rise in online harassment, including, in particular, against female journalists. Of course, that affects journalism and journalism practices. There's also targeted action by the organized crime sector. Europol, in its 2021 report, pointed out that there is a growing danger against investigative journalists by organized criminal gangs. Then there's the issue of how states respond to the alerts that have been raised by the platform. Only 35% of the alerts were reacted to, and very few of the responses were then actually considered satisfactory by members of the platform. I think Renate Schröder outlined the current situation, which is that things are more fragile, insecure, there's greater precariousness. That's not just due to the economic model. Of course, the economic model is an important issue, but there's true hostility against journalists, which is fed by various organizations who think that the press isn't important in maintaining democracy. All of this is exacerbated by the fact that some high-level politicians denigrate journalists, which opens the door to violence against journalists. I'll stop there, but if you have questions, I'll hopefully be able to react.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. We have reached the end of the first panel. Now I'd like to open the Q&A. Ms. Ramona Victoria Strugariu is the first speaker. She is the probable Libe rapporteur for the Media Freedom Act. In the coming months, I'm sure we'll be working hard together. She'll be working hard with the two committees. Ms. Strugariu.
Thank you very much, Chair. I was pressing the voting button because I'm coming from a vote in Libe, which turned very complicated, and I kept, the habit of doing in the other committee. Thank you for this, and thank you for the opportunity to take the floor in this exchange of views. I am actually still not happy with all what we do, although we've done a lot, but there's plenty of space, more space to do related to media freedom and to the protection of journalists. And I know that this has been an ongoing debate in this House. We've been asking for it for years. The Commission is making efforts, but somehow I think we are still far, and there are ways to improve things. I'm happy to see that the organizations for the protection of journalists are more and more involved in the process, because they know better how to do it, and they do have the experience on the ground as well. And I truly hope that we will also listen more and more to their voices when we take decisions related to the safety of the journalists and to how to better protect their work and their fight for the truth. Because in the end, they are the guardians of democracies, and they are those who make sure that we continue to live in free worlds. Related to Ukraine and the war, we all know that 12 journalists have been killed in this war while exercising their job. These killings must be recognized as war crimes. But it is not only about these 12 people. It is about hundreds of attacks only in Ukraine to media freedom. It is about bombing radio and TV stations, and is about plenty of disinformation, about threats, and about all these activities that we see not only in a war, but everywhere, in hybrid wars as well, masterfully done by propaganda, which are killing, basically, democracy and truth every day. Journalists reporting now from the front line need our support more than ever, and one of the first things that I asked and we asked through the media working group was for the member states and for this House to support sending equipment, protection equipment to journalists which were in Ukraine, and basic things that they needed. And we knew that organizations and civil society were organizing themselves to send this equipment, but we didn't see maybe the same instinct coming from member states or being an organized decision, you know, that reflex of defending media workers in the field as they immediately went there, or those Ukrainian ones. And maybe this exercise we should also do more often. Questions that I have and that I would like to address are, of course, also matters of reflection. I would like to know about how your organizations have been in support to the journalists from the front line. How can we support your activity, and how can we make sure those necessary supplies make it to them? Do you know, and if yes, how do you monitor the evolution of the situation of those journalists on the front? Do you have a better picture of their immediate needs? How can we be of any help in increasing the visibility of these needs and bringing them into the attention of decision makers? In the context of safeguarding media freedom and protecting journalists, we should not forget those Russian independent journalists who are currently under heavy attack back in their home country, many of them having had to leave Russia. Are you in touch with them? Are there ways that we can help them? And last but not least, I believe it is high time that we create this EU-wide network of opposition Russian and Russian-speaking journalists in order to gather these efforts of counteracting Kremlin propaganda, both in Russia and abroad, and not only opposition journalists. Maybe opposition journalists is not the proper way, because their journalists are not with the power or with the opposition. But this broad platform with gathered, united efforts from the civil society, from journalists, and from every free voice, as a matter of fact, that Russia has in the diaspora, so that we can properly counter that and change things there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this intervention and the questions. And before I switch to the questions of the members of our committee, I would like to welcome a visitors group.
Today we have visitors. They've been invited by Hannes Haider. This is a group of teachers who are from Wels in Austria at a vocational school. Vocational schools in Austria and Germany are part of the so-called dual training system. We have practical and academic.